So let's take a look at our faux buttonhole, faux button closure. So we're going to be working with these two patterns, the faux button left placket pattern and the faux button right placket pattern. Cut one each out of muslin. You will need at least 3 buttons. I do recommend a flat button, not a button with a shank. I've got a couple of buttons here, reject buttons from a garment that I bought and I didn't like the buttons on it, so I took the buttons off. So I'm going to use these buttons for my sample. We don't have a whole lot of room to install these buttons, so I recommend getting a button that's 1 inch in diameter or smaller. 1 inch is going to be a little bit hefty, but it'll be fine for the samples. These, I believe, are 3/4 of an inch. Yeah, these are 3/4 of an inch, so they're a little bit smaller. And they should fit onto the sample. So you'll need at least 3 buttons, preferably flat buttons. You will also need hook and loop tape or Velcro brand if you're purchasing the brand name. And the hook and loop tape needs to be 1/2 inch wide. There's not a big space in order to put this in here. If it's much larger than this, you're going to have a little bit of trouble. So get the, I've got 5/8, mine is 5/8 inch wide, which is perfectly fine. 1/2 inch, 5/8, that should work. Make sure to get the sew on hook and loop tape. If you get hook and loop tape that has adhesive on the back, you're going to gum up the needle and it's going to mess up the machine. So make sure there's no sticky stuff on the back of the hook and loop tape. Now I'm using black hook and loop tape so you can easily see the placement of it on my muslin, but you're welcome to use black or white or khaki, whatever color you need. So the patterns, the buttons, the hook and loop tape, you will need a needle and thread because we're going to be sewing our buttons on and we're going to be doing some basting stitches. I also recommend getting some transfer paper. I've got my chalk transfer paper and my serrated wheel here so we can transfer the placement for our hook and loop tape. If you do not have transfer paper, you'll need to take measurements, use your ruler so you can take measurements off of the pattern and transfer these little rectangles onto your muslin. I'm going to go ahead and copy all of my notation from my patterns. I'm going to start with this guy over here. I will do a tailor's tack with my thread. So remember doing tailor's tacks. I've got 3, 1, 2, 3 dots here. So recall when you're doing a tailor's tack, double length of thread, no knot in the end, in and out through the pattern and the fabric, all the way through. One time, leaving tails, and that should be fine for a single length of fabric, for a single layer of fabric. If you're working with 2 layers of fabric, you would take 2 stitches to make your tailor's tack. But this should be fine for what we're doing. There's my other one, through the pattern and the fabric at the same time, in, out, leaving tails on both ends, and done. And the third one, in and out through the pattern and the fabric, leave tails at the beginning and the end, snip your thread, and done. I'm going to put some more thread on my needle because I'm going to need it for later. Don't forget, if you need to wax your thread, make sure to run it through the iron, sandwich it between some scrap fabric, and then run a hot iron over it to melt your wax. I'm just going to get this ready to go. I'm going to wax my thread because we're going to do some hand stitching, some hand basting in just a moment. Alright, got my needle rethreaded. I'm going to set that aside for right now. Got my tailor's tacks. Let's get the placement for this hook tape in place. If you've never used transfer paper, There's one side that usually has a chalk. Sometimes it's a wax-based chalk. Sometimes it's just sticky, powdery chalk. This one has powdery chalk. The opposite side shouldn't have much of anything on it. It should just be a blank piece of paper. Now I want to mark the right side of my fabric, so I'm going to place this chalk side down in between my pattern and my fabric. I want to have all my markings facing up towards me. So chalk side down on top of my fabric. I'm going to lay my pattern on top of that, and using my serrated tracing wheel, I'm going to mark out the corners for where this hook tape should go. I'm not too worried about the long straightaways. I really just need the corners of the rectangle. As long as I've got all those 4 points, I can always connect the dots to make that rectangle. And just to ensure that that's copied, I will lift up my transfer paper, lift up my chalk. It's on there, but it's hard to see. I'll put something light underneath so you can see it. There's the top edge. Here's the bottom edge here. And just so you guys can see it a little better on the video, I will just trace over those corners with my friction pen. You don't have to do this, but I'm just highlighting these so you can see that on the video a little bit better. So there's placement, and it should match where this is. I'm also going to clip my notches. I've got 4 notches on here, clipping through the paper and the fabric. Okay. If you want to copy the fold lines, you can, but we've got the notches to indicate where those fold lines are. So this one's taken care of. I can remove my pins and carefully remove my pattern, making sure my tailor's tacks stay attached to my fabric. And this one is ready to go. I'm going to set this aside. That's going to be our left placket. I'm going to keep the pattern with it just so I can make note of all the notation on there. And I'm going to just do the same thing over here. I've got this right placket, so I'm going to copy the placement for my loop tape. Again, taking my transfer paper, placing it chalk side down in between my fabric and my pattern, tracing over the corners. Helps to have something light underneath so you guys can see. There's 2 corners down there and 2 corners up here. And again, I will mark that with my friction pen. I can see it, but so you guys can see it on the video. There are my 4 corners for my placement, and I'm going to pin this one more time and snip all my notches. You'll see me kind of pass my scissor back and forth. I'm making sure that my scissor is getting underneath my fabric because it doesn't make any sense to notch the pattern because it's not the pattern that I really need to have notched. It's the fabric that I need to have notches. All right. So we've got our 2 patterns. We've got our notation copied. Let's start with the left placket pattern, the one with the tailor's tacks. This will take the most time, and then we'll come back to our right placket pattern. So the left placket pattern, what we want to do is place our hook and loop tape. If you're going to sew buttonholes, you're going to want to do that first before we add the buttons on. Let's get the hook and loop tape out of the way, regardless of whether you're making buttonholes or not. I'm going to do my hook and loop tape. Now I've gone through the trouble of trying to figure out which side should go onto which. This should be your hook tape that goes here. You'll see it says hook tape placement. It's different on the other pattern. It will say the loop tape placement. So your hook and loop tape should come with one piece that's really kind of hard and scraggly, and it's got a lot of teeny little loops coming up out of it. So this should be the hard scraggly side. That's your hook side. And then you've got another one that's nice and soft and supple, feels kind of like a soft fleecy kind of texture. This is your loop tape. So these are your hooks. That's the hard scratchy one, and your loops is the soft one. So we're working with the hook, so I should have a hard scraggly piece here. These are kind of little plasticky loops. Now, if you have this placement is designed to hold 6 inches of hook and loop tape. So if you're following the syllabus and you only have 12 inches of this, you can cut your hook and loop tape in half. So you have 2 6-inch pieces. If you have more than that and you want to use more than that, you can extend this all the way from the top of the sample to the bottom. It really doesn't matter. But for the sake of following the pattern, I'm going to make sure that my hook tape matches the length that I've got here. So it should be about 6 inches. I'm just matching this to the pattern length. So I can see the top of my pattern here and the bottom here. So I've got this at the same length. There are 2 sides to your hook and loop tape. Here's my hook tape. Here's the back of it. It's just a black webbing kind of material. And on the other side is the plastic hooks that come up off of the fabric, off of the tape. Let me move this out of the way. So one side's got little scragglies coming up on this side, and the other side should be nice and flat and smooth. The flat, smooth side is the side that attaches to your garment. Doesn't make any sense to put the hooks down in your garment. So this is my scratchy side. This is my smooth side. I'm putting this smooth side down onto my muslin and doing my best to position it, center it, given my notation that I copied from my pattern. And I'm going to try my best to pin this to my fabric. Now this isn't imperative because we're going to hand sew this temporarily, but just so that the positioning is there, do be advised this tape is hard to get through, so you really got to push that pin through. But pin it just so it doesn't go flying all over the place. And then I'm going to grab my needle and thread. I've got a single length of thread. I'm going to put a knot in the end. And I'm going to try to keep my hook and loop tape centered in the right position here. There's my 2 marks. Mine's a little bit wider than the pattern, but it's okay as long as it's somewhere down there. And I'm going to go in and out through my hook and loop tape. So I'm going to go down through the hook and loop tape and my garment and come back up. So remember the running stitches that you did at the start of the sample book. I'm doing the exact same stitch. This is referred to as a basting stitch. So instead of having pins all along here, which you can do, but pins tend to buckle and pucker your fabric and your hook and loop tape, I'm going to hand baste this in place. I'm going to sew it by hand, just in and out, up and down, to hold this in place temporarily before I get it onto the sewing machine. So up and down through one side, through both layers. And again, this is hard to get through, so you're going to have to be a little bit forceful with it. Don't be too concerned about getting it perfect. The stitches are going to go all over the place, and remember, you're going to remove these stitches later anyway. What's important is to try to keep the tape as straight as possible, because if it veers too far this way or too far this way, it will get in the way when we go to do our final sewing on the sample. Got my needle coming through there. I'm doing like 1/2-inch stitches. Again, doesn't really matter what the stitches, what these hand stitches look like, because we're going to remove them before we're finished with this. As I come to the other end of my hook and loop tape, I'm going to remove this pin because, like I say, these pins tend to buckle the fabric and do weird stuff. So I'm just going to get rid of it so I can lay this flatter against my fabric. On an actual garment, depending on the fabric that you're using, you may end up putting interfacing behind this just to stabilize your fabric. But for a sample, it's okay not to have interfacing back there. And I'm just going to come up and back down through my hook and loop tape in the same spot. I don't need to put a knot in this thread. I just need to kind of go over the same stitch twice, just so my threads don't unravel. Just remember, we're going to take that stitching out, so as long as it is straight and positioned as close to what the pattern dictates, you're good to go. Set the thread and needle aside because we're going to need that later. Okay, so let's move on to sewing this. Now, if you've got this in place, you're good. Let's take this to the sewing machine and stitch this hook and loop tape into place so we can call that done and dusted. So here I am at my machine. I've put some contrasting threads in my machine just so you can see them a little bit better on the video. My top thread is black, my bobbin thread is blue, and here is my sample. So what we're going to do is we're going to sew around this rectangle, around the outer edge of the hook and loop tape. You can use this same foot as long as you've got relatively thin hook and loop tape. Anything more heavy duty than this and we would have to switch presser feet. But I'm going to start somewhere around here, somewhere around the middle of this long edge. Remember to use a number 2 stitch, so check the stitch length on your machine. And remember to use a number 2 stitch. I'm going to lower my presser foot. Just like when top stitching, I want to try to position this edge of the hook and loop tape right up along the inner edge of this toe so that I'm stitching about a 1/16 of an inch on my hook and loop tape. Now you're not going to see my stitches too well since I've got black thread on black Velcro, but you should be able to see the bobbin stitches once I'm finished. Just going to lower my needle into my work, and we're going to try to keep the needle along this webbing on the side. If you look really closely on your hook and loop tape, you should see all these little scratchy loops in here, and then along either side should be just webbing, and we want to try to keep our stitches within that webbing. Now on an industrial machine will go over these hooks no problem. Some home machines will stitch over these hooks no problem, but some older machines might not be able to get over these plastic hooks very well. We've already basted our work in place, so I should be able to just stitch all the way down this edge. Remember to keep this aligned to the inner toe, inner edge of that toe. And just like our machine sewing sample, when I get to this corner down here, I'm going to walk my stitches just so I have more control. Make sure your needle is down in your work. Lift your presser foot and pivot around this corner. And I'm going to walk my stitches to this other edge of my hook and loop tape. Make sure the needle is down in your work. Lift your presser foot, pivot around again, and work your way up the other side. Walk my stitches as I get to this other corner. Close enough. Make sure the needle is down in your work. Lift the presser foot and pivot around that short side. Again, make sure the needle is down in the work. Lift the presser foot, pivot again. And as we come along the other side here, I can see where my original thread is. You can see a little bit of my bobbin thread poking up through here. Just overlap your stitches. No need to back tack, just overlap. Take about 5 or 6 stitches over the original stitches that you started with. And you should be good to go. That's enough to lock in your stitches. Lift your needle out of the work, lift your presser foot, make sure your take-up lever is all the way up, and you should be able to remove your work from the machine. Clip your threads. And you should have your hook tape in place. There's my bobbin stitches, so you can see it's just a little rectangle there. I'm going to, since I'm here and I've got my snips, start pulling these basting stitches out. Now, if you stitch them correctly, you do that running stitch back and forth, up and down, up and down, up and down, you should be able to just pull, once you get the knot out of the end, you should be able to just pull all those stitches right out. So no more unsightly basting stitches stuck in there. It's just our machine stitches. Let's head back to the work table and continue with this piece. All right, got our hook and loop tape in place. It's a little bit crooked, but it's okay. If you're going to sew buttonholes, let's talk a little bit about the buttonholes. I recommend doing a vertical buttonhole. We don't have a lot of room to work with horizontally here, so our fold line will become the finished edge of our sample. So I recommend doing vertical buttonholes, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to place buttonholes. I'm going to zoom in on this center tailor's tack. This is essentially where my button would be sewn on my garment. So that's, I would just place the center of my button right there on top of that tailor's tack. When you're doing buttonholes, you need 2 things. You need to know the placement of where your button's going, and you need to know the diameter of your button from one edge to the other. So I'm going to take my ruler here and I'm just going to place the widest part of the button here. Like I mentioned, it's about 3/4 of an inch. That's 1/4, 1/2, and 3/4 of an inch in diameter. So when you're making buttonholes for your buttons, you want your buttonholes to be the diameter of your button plus 1/8 of an inch. Remember, one of these little squares is 1/8 of an inch. So if I know where my button is going to go here, and I know that this is the direction of my buttonhole, I want to make it vertical. Imagine this is on the actual wearer. For vertical buttonholes, imagine the neck is up here, the neck of your wearer is up here, and their waist is somewhere down here. For vertical buttonholes, you're going to go from your tailor's tack and measure down the diameter of your button. So that will always go towards the waist of your wearer. So down 3/4 of an inch. That's the button diameter. So from the tailor's tack straight down towards the waist of the wearer is the button diameter. From the tailor's tack up 1/8 of an inch. So that is 1/8 of an inch. This extra 1/8 of an inch allows for that thread shank. So when you're sewing this button onto your garment, that big old wad of thread that hangs out underneath here has a little bit of room to sit right in this space here. If you don't give that extra 1/8 of an inch, it can push your button down ever so slightly. That thread shank gets stuck right here at the edge of your buttonhole. It pushes the button down, and then it's no longer sitting in the right place. So we add this extra 1/8 of an inch to make room for this thread shank that you would eventually sew onto your garment. Now, this sample are faux buttonholes. They're not going to be functioning buttonholes, but this is still the placement you would want for your buttonholes. So up 1/8 of an inch towards the neck of the wearer and down by the diameter of your button. Depending on the size of your button, this goes down towards the waistline of the wearer. So your buttonhole would sit right here. That little rectangle there. And it's the same for the rest of them. Down by the diameter of your button. For mine, that's 3/4 of an inch, and up by 1/8. So if I were to sew buttonholes, I would start up here, do one leg of the buttonhole, stop here, do a bar tack at the bottom, do the second leg of the buttonhole here, and finish off with another bar tack. Same thing up here, just to reiterate, down towards the waist of the wearer by the diameter of your button and up by 1/8. Now I will not be sewing buttonholes on mine, just in the interest of time. It's not necessary for the sample, and because at the moment I don't have a machine that will reliably sew buttonholes here at home. I have one that will sew buttonholes, but it is not there, not consistent, and I don't want to deal with it right now. So I won't be sewing buttonholes, but if you're working on a costume or a garment and you want it to look like these are legitimate buttons that are seated inside of buttonholes, you're going to want to sew your buttonholes. So this would be the time to sew them. You see where the tailor's tacks are, so you can measure 1/8 of an inch up, and however wide your button is, the diameter of your button down, and I would sew those now while your fabric is flat and you have access to it before we start folding everything up. So if you're doing buttonholes, do those now. 1, 2, 3 buttonholes, and do make those vertical buttonholes. Once that is done, if you're not doing buttonholes and you just follow along with me, we've got some notches here, 1/4 of an inch in from this raw edge over here where your hook tape is. Turn that under by 1/4 of an inch. So all your raw edges are sitting up under there. So again, here's your hook tape. This is the hooky part facing up. This is the back of the sample, just so you can see it. 1/4 of an inch in from this raw edge, fold that under. I'm going to take this to the iron and press it so it's nice and crisp. Just be careful when you're ironing. Try to keep them as quick little bursts of steam so you don't accidentally melt these hooks. It's not likely to happen anytime soon. Just be aware. One or two little blasts of steam should be enough to press this into place. So 1/4 of an inch folded under. We have another set of notches about 1 inch away. This is very much like our hem finish samples, where we turned under 1/4 inch and then we turned under another inch. I'm going to do the same thing right along those 2 notches, turn under an additional inch. So now our hook tape is hiding underneath our sample. So this would be the outside of your garment, and you'd have your hook tape hiding underneath here. Now we sew the hook tape first because we don't want to see these bobbin stitches coming out through the outside of the garment. I'm going to press this one more time. So remember, fold on the notches. The notches indicate where the folds are. If it's not clear, make sure to follow the fold line. So you're folding along those lines, under and under again. So I'm going to press this one more time. There we go. So just so you can see that again, this is what we started with. Pressed under 1/4 of an inch and turned and pressed under 1/4 of an inch, turned and pressed under another inch. So remember to follow the notches on the pattern. I'm just going to get my tailor's tacks out of the way, because the next thing I'm going to do is secure this flap of fabric by top stitching it in place. I'm going to turn my work to the inside. This would be the inside of my garment. And I'm going to go back to the sewing machine. And remember, with our turned and stitched seam sample, I'm going to line up this fold of my fabric with the inner toe of my presser foot and stitch right along here at a 1/16 of an inch all the way down. Back tack at the beginning and back tack at the end. All right, so again, here's the outside of my sample where my tailor's tacks are for my buttons. I'm going to turn this around. There's my hook tape. I'm going to place this into my machine in this orientation. So I'm essentially sewing from the inside of the garment. It is a top stitch because it is going to be visible from the outside of the garment. Again, lining up this fold. This is where that 1/4 inch is hiding. That little 1/4 inch raw edge of fabric is hiding underneath there. This fold aligned to the inner edge of this toe. Back tack at the beginning, a number 2 stitch. And top stitch through. Now I haven't pinned my work, so make sure you're pressing this really well. And back tack at the end. Make sure your take-up lever's all the way up. Lift your presser foot. Remove your work. Trim your threads. And there's my top stitching from the inside of the garment and from the outside of the garment. So this is what the outside, quote unquote outside, of my garment is looking like. Still got my tailor's tacks in place, 1, 2, 3, so I know where to position my buttons. Some of them got caught in my top stitching, so I'm going to have to snip them out of there. That's fine. You can see there's my blue bobbin thread. So that is top stitching. That would be visible from the outside of the garment. Just like our hem finish, you can hand stitch this, do a slip stitch, an uneven slip stitch, so that you would barely be able to see the stitches from the outside. But top stitching is a little bit easier. I'm going to go ahead and sew my buttons into place. Got my thread ready. I'm using a double length of thread. Make a little knot. And recall back to the button sewing video. If you're not familiar with sewing on buttons, I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly. Remember, when you're sewing these on, once you get through it, you will be encountering your hook tape underneath here. So make sure you do your best to try to sew through only this top layer of fabric. So remember, we've got a fold right here. So you're going to have to practice taking some shallow stitches. So, because if you go all the way through here, you're going to encounter that loop tape. It's going to be really hard to sew into. And why bother sewing into it? Everything's already secured. I'm going to start with this one up here, right where my tailor's tack is, right here. I'm going to take a small stitch. I haven't really encountered my hook and loop tape too much, but this is why we get into the habit of putting our fingers behind our work, because if you feel this needle poke through to your finger, you know you've gone too far and you need to pull the needle back ever so slightly through the fabric. I'm using this pulling motion. I'm showing this. It's a little more dramatic than what I'm doing, but notice how I've got my finger, my pointer finger anchored, and I'm using my thumb to pull back. I've got my thumb and my middle finger here, thumb and middle finger, and I'm pulling it back like this. So you get into the habit of kind of retracting the tip of the needle. So if you push through your fabric and you feel it poke you in the finger, pull it back a little bit more and then try it again until you can push all the way through without feeling it on the back of your sample. I'm going to remove this tailor's tack since I know where I'm anchoring my needle. Go ahead and pull this through and anchor that ugly little knot there. And then I'm going to go up and down through the holes of my button. Secure my needle again, in and out through my fabric. I'm going all the way through a little bit there, but it's okay. And I'm going to pull this tight, and then I'm going to grab my sewing pin and sit that right in between my button and my garment, just to give a little bit of lift to my button. I like to fold my fabric out of the way so I can reach my buttonholes a little bit better. Go back up through that hole. I lost my pin. Just be careful, just don't put the death grip on this. Don't pull your thread so tight. Now I've put my needle in between my button and garment, but notice I've also anchored it through my garment down here, just so it doesn't slide out again. Back down through the other eye of the button, and through my fabric, my garment again. So in and out through the garment again. That's 2 rounds. And back up through the eyes. One, 2, and that's 3 rounds of stitching through the eyes. I'm going to take one more stitch in my garment. Remove my pin. And now I'm going to create my thread shank. I'm going to twirl the thread around the button about 3 or 4 times. Take a tiny stitch, just kind of sandwich everything in between my fingers so it doesn't come unraveled. Take a tiny stitch through my garment to anchor my thread, and another tiny stitch in the same place. And as this loop comes through, put my needle through the loop and pull everything tight to place a knot in my thread. Trim my thread, and there's one button secured. Should be a little bit loose, should have a little bit of give. I'll move down to the next one, put a knot in my thread again. Now this is where I'm going to meet some resistance. I'm not going to push too hard because my hook tape is underneath there. It's not going to let me go too far unless I really, really force it through. So long as I'm picking up some fibers of thread, I'm good to go. I'm going to take this tailor's tack out because it's in my way. Anchor my knot, grab another button. In through one hole, out through the other, down through the other. Take another stitch in the same place. Pull my threads tight, but not too tight. Place my needle between my button and my garment. My pin, excuse me. Place my pin through my button, my garment. I'm going to go through the garment a little bit just so it doesn't come out of the way. I'm going to fold my garment fabric back a little bit so that I can get, oh, my threads are twisted. Untwist those threads. They were twisted up back here. See that little X? So I'm just going to twirl it until they come untwisted. It really doesn't matter if they twist though, but sometimes it causes the orientation of the button eyes to kind of tilt. But when you're backstage and you just need to get a button on, it doesn't really matter if the buttons are crooked. Up through one eye, down through the other. Take another stitch in my garment. Up through one eye, down through the other. Okay. I think that's 3 rounds. I could be wrong, but it's okay. Stitch through the garment one more time to anchor my threads. I believe that's 3 rounds. I'll remove my pin, create my thread shank. Pinch everything together, button, garment, got fingers back there, I'm pinching everything together. Taking a little stitch in my garment just to anchor my threads. Another stitch in the same spot. And as this thread comes through, place my needle through the loop. Pull everything tight to knot my thread and trim my tails. That's 2 buttons done. Let's do the last. Here's my last tailor's tack. In and out through my garment. Take my tailor's tack out of the way. Anchor my knot up and down through the eyes of the button. Take another stitch in the garment. Before I pull it too tight, place my pin between my garment and my button and just anchor it into the garment just a little bit so the pin doesn't fall out. Then I can pull my threads a little bit tighter. And then back through the holes of the button. That's 2 rounds. Stitch into my garment. I'm meeting some resistance from my hook tape. That's 2 rounds. Back through the 2 eyes of the button again. And stitch back into my garment one more time. That should be 3 rounds of stitching. Okay, remove my pin, create my thread shank, twirl this around 3 or 4 times, pinching everything. I still got my fingers behind my work here, pinching everything so this thread doesn't come loose. Take a tiny stitch in the garment just to anchor the threads. Another tiny stitch in the same place. And before that loop comes all the way through, place my needle through the loop, pull everything tight to create a knot, and trim my threads. I'm going to give this one little quick press on the ironing board because I've got a little bit of a wrinkle from holding my fabric over here. When ironing over buttons, You want to avoid placing the iron directly on top of the buttons. You want the nose of the iron, the little pointed nose of the iron, to kind of go in between your buttons. Smaller buttons can leave an indentation, an imprint on your fabric, so you want to avoid putting the iron directly on top of them. Not to mention most buttons are made out of plastic and could potentially melt under the heat of an industrial iron. This is the left placket taken care of. So we've installed our hook and loop tape, we top stitched it, we folded our fabric and top stitched it into place, and then sewed our 3 buttons. If you were doing buttonholes, you would position and sew your hook tape. You would then sew your buttonholes, fold your fabric under 1/4 inch, an additional 1 inch, top stitch it in place, and then install your buttons on top of your buttonholes. So you can imagine little peaks of a buttonhole peeking through here would look like there's a button that's coming through a buttonhole. Let's take a look at the right placket pattern. This will take a lot less time to do, and I'm going to kind of rush through it a little bit because the technique for finishing this is very much the same as doing this, just without buttons. So I've got my notches, I've got the position of my loop tape. Remember that this is the loop side. So we've got the scratchy hooky side over here. Now we're going to put the loop side over there. So I'm going to grab my soft loop tape, position it on my pattern so I can make sure I'm cutting it to the right length, as close as possible. Should be 6 inches. So one end to one end over there. I'm going to remove my pattern, make sure everything is still oriented in the same way as the pattern. Position the loop tape according to where that rectangle is and pin it in place. Remember to keep it as straight as possible. It's going to be unwieldy. I know, just be patient. All right, and baste this in place, hand baste it in place. Single length of thread. This should be much easier to sew through. It's much softer than the hook tape. In and out. It's just a running stitch. I went down through all layers, came back up through all layers. Work slowly. Make sure you kind of lay your work out flat to make sure that that the tape is not bowing out to one side or the other. You want to keep it as straight as possible. And as I get to the end, I'll just take one more tiny stitch. Not tiny stitch, it's like a 1/4 inch stitch. If you make it too tiny, it's going to be hard to rip out. Trim my tails. I am done with my needle and thread, and we'll go back to the machine and stitch this in place the same way we stitched the hook tape. So we're going to start on one long edge, pivot around the corners, pivot again, and then overlap our stitching over on the edge here. All right, back at the machine, I'm going to start along this long edge here. Again, I want to position the edge of my loop tape right along the inner edge of this toe so that I'm sewing it a 1/16 of an inch. Number 2 stitch, start along one of the long edges. Walk stitches into the corner, make sure the needle's down, lift your presser foot, pivot, Walk to the opposite corner, needle down, lift the presser foot, pivot. Walk to the corner, needle down, lift the presser foot, pivot. Walk to the opposite corner, needle down, lift the foot, pivot. As you approach your original line of stitching, that's where my tails are, just overlap 5 or 6 stitches. Make sure your take-up lever is all the way up. Needle is out of your work. Lift your presser foot, remove your work. Clip the tails of thread. And we're back over. Oh, I'll remove my basting stitches while I'm here. It should just slide right out. There you can see my bobbin thread, so it's a little bit easier to see what kind of sewing I did. Just a rectangle around the edge of that loop tape. And let's head back to the work table. Now to finish up our right placket, we should still have a set of notches, one at 1/4 inch from the cut edge over here, and another at 1 inch away from that, so 1 1/4 inches from the edge. So I've got my little notches, and just as we did on the other sample, on the other placket, I'm going to fold under by 1/4 inch, fold on the notches. Remember, follow your pattern notation. The notches are positioned along the fold lines, so fold along those notches. So I'm going to fold under and press this. So this was what we started with. I folded this under, so now I've got a raw edge underneath here. And again, I've got another set of notches. I'm going to fold this under again, same direction, fold it under along those notches again. So we're ending up with the same kind of thing we had with our hem finishes, where we're folding under and folding under again. So I folded under 1/4 inch. Remember, this is the fuzzy part of my hook and loop tape, and there's my basting stitches underneath there. This is the outside of the garment. This would be the inside. So we're folding under towards the inside of the garment. And again, about 1 inch away, remember to fold where the notches are, fold along the fold line as indicated in the pattern. And press this one more time. Okay, so once again, we started with this. We folded under 1/4 inch, so that went up underneath, and we folded under again. So now this is the outside of our sample with the soft loop tape facing up. And then this is the inside of our sample. Now, just as we did before, I'll pin this time. We're going to go to the sewing machine, and we're going to top stitch this fold into place so that that stays secure. So one more time, here's our loop tape, the soft fuzzy loop fiber, whatever you want to call them. Those are facing up. Underneath, we've got a double fold on the inside of the garment. So we folded under 1/4 inch and then another inch, and I will top stitch this into place. So stitching along the fold. Now to keep it oriented, so hopefully you guys can follow along. Up until now, I've been pushing the fold of my fabric up against the innermost edge of the right side of my foot. But now that we're working on the other side, you can always flip this sample around. If it makes more sense to turn the whole thing around, you can continue to do the same orientation. But I also want to show you that it's possible to do this in either orientation. You can always push the folded edge of the fabric up against the inner edge of this toe, the leftmost toe. Number 2 stitch, back tack at the beginning. Make sure to remove your pins as you go. If you press this properly, you shouldn't have any buckling or warping or anything over here. And back tack at the end. Make sure your take-up lever is all the way up. Lift your presser foot. Remove your work. Snip the threads. There's my top stitching. I lost it a little bit there. If I were working on an actual garment, I would remove these few stitches and restitch that, but since it's a sample, I can't be bothered. There's my bobbin thread as it appears on the right side of the garment. And remember, you can also finish this with an uneven slip stitch. And let's head back to the work table and see how this all comes together. All right, so there's my loop tape. Remember, you place this, stitch around, install this first, and then turn under 1/4 inch and under the remaining inch, folding along the fold lines indicated on the pattern, and then top stitch that into place. When combined with the the left placket sample, your hook and loop tape, you should be able to line these up. Press your hook and loop tape together. It's held together. You can't see your hook and loop tape from the inside or outside of the garment. You could definitely feel it though, but it looks like a regular buttoned closure when in fact it can quickly be removed with your hook and loop tape. One reason we place the hook tape, you can imagine if this was someone was laying, you're wearing this on a person, the hook tape would go down towards the person. Whether you put the hook tape on the garment on the side that faces away from the wearer or towards the wearer is kind of negligible, but I have found that putting hook tape closer to the body, where it kind of pushes away from the body, tends to get snagged. You tend to get it snagged on things more often, which is why we placed our hook tape over here, so it comes in towards the body. It's less likely to get snagged. And again, you're welcome to install buttonholes here, but it is not required for this sample.